What is going on, alpha males? Welcome to the Alpha Male Podcast, the podcast where we talk about being a man the right way, with God at the center, Judeo-Christian values, and real-world, first-hand experience. Coming at you today from the mobile studio, driving cross-country. Right now I am in Wyoming, on the way to Cheyenne. I'll be doing this for a while, as the plan, by God's grace, if He wills, will be to go to Michigan and then to Florida. The wife wants to spend some time with her family. But anyway, all that to say, hope you still appreciate the podcast if it's not in the normal studio, i.e. the laptop set on top of the weight rack where I normally work out and where I normally record. So today we're going to be talking about the M.A.R.C.H algorithm as it pertains to emergency medicine. And we may talk about some other emergency medical things. I know I've done podcast episodes similar to this in the past, but I think it's important and I think it's worth revisiting. I may or may not plug in the bio. Just want to say first and foremost, I am a servant of God and a follower of Jesus Christ. That is number one in everything that I do, and I hope that stays central in my life, and this podcast is part of that. Also, I want to mention I did receive TCCC, which is Tactical Combat Casualty Care. Also, as you might imagine, through my time in the military and police, I received quite a bit of medical training, and it has sure come a long way since I joined the Marine Corps at 17 back in 2001. I'll probably talk about it a little bit more in the body of the show. But that to say, I have received TCCC training. I have received instruction on the M.A.R.C.H algorithm. I have first-hand experience doing it, sadly, in the real world. But I am not a TCCC instructor. This is not a TCCC course. You should go get hands-on and get your hands dirty in some real medical training. This is an audio podcast. It does not replace you getting actual medical training. Okay, so something I will mention briefly I don't normally mention in the bio. I was also a lifeguard for quite a while, and that will come in later in the episode. But quite a bit of medical training there as well, which has also changed quite a bit over the years. Getting into the M.A.R.C.H algorithm, which is big now. It's changed. The algorithm has changed. In fact, it's almost flip-flopped from when I first started receiving medical training in the 1990s. But one thing remains constant, whether it's a tactical situation or you as a civilian. Before you start administering medical care, you need to make sure the scene is safe. You need to survey the scene. You need to look around and make sure it's safe. It's not going to help the person if you rush in and both you and that person are now dead or need serious medical care. It goes from that person needing medical care to that person and you needing medical care. If you receive some kind of massive injury, you're not only not helping that person, you're hurting that person, because the next people that respond not only have to help them, they have to help you. Now, I'm going to draw on some training and experience here. When I was the commander of a tactical team to stop active shooters, we did quite a bit of force-on-force and actually had actors and things like that. And one of the hardest things to get my men to do was to run past a wounded person screaming for help, that they were bleeding out and they were dying. It was hard to get my guys to not stop and administer medical aid to them. But remember, our primary mission was to stop active shooters. That was our prime directive. It doesn't help anybody, that person included, if we stop to help that person and then 5 other people get shot and or die, and half the team gets shot because we're giving medical care instead of taking care of the active shooter. It just doesn't make sense. And I know as a human it tugs at the heartstrings to want to stop and help that person. But again, while you're helping that one person, even if it takes 90 seconds, an active shooter can destroy a lot of lives in 90 seconds. You need to get to that threat and take out that threat. And we had to hammer that into the men over and over again to do that. That's a hard thing because you're kind of hardwired, if you're a good person, to stop and help out. But it may be counterproductive and it may be detrimental to do such in those kind of circumstances. And it doesn't always have to be an active shooter situation. Think about this. You see somebody shallow breathing, convulsing on the floor in a puddle of water, and you just run up and start to help them. But if you don't do a survey of the scene first, you may look around and realize that there's a downed power line or open electrical wires in that puddle of water. And if you rush up and help them, you're going to be in that same situation. So now, not only is that person not getting help, but you also need help. Again, not only are you not helping that person, you're hurting that person and yourself. And there's any number of situations where you could actually do more harm than good by rushing in half-cocked. Do a scene survey. It should only take literally seconds to do a survey of the scene. Also, one time as a police officer, as you might imagine, I did several years as a police officer, LAPD, working regular assignments, more specialized assignments. I had some pretty horrific accidents that I came up on. But this one in particular, I witnessed a pretty bad car wreck early in the morning. This person was going fast and just plowed headfirst into something. And by the time I get up there, me and some other people got there at about the same time. And I was not in police uniform, I was in regular clothes. And they tried to yank this person out of the car. And I quickly told them to stop doing that because the car was not on fire. There was no danger of the car being on fire or anything like that. That person likely sustained some pretty nasty head injuries, back injuries. There's no reason to go dragging that person out of the car if they're not in immediate danger. Like if they're bleeding out, that's a different story. Like if they had some kind of massive bleeding and they needed a tourniquet, by all means move them. But if you don't need to move them, if they may have received massive head trauma, neck trauma, spine trauma, then do not move them. Wait for people with the proper equipment, backboards, neck braces, to move that person or to determine whether they have any kind of spinal injury. You may do far more harm than good dragging them out of a car if they don't need to be dragged out of the car. That's just another example of those people meant to do good, but they could have done massive harm because they wanted to help, but they weren't doing it properly. So a scene survey is massively important. Before we even get in to the M.A.R.C.H algorithm, survey the scene. Now, when I first got into emergency medical stuff, it was the ABCs, airway, breathing, circulation, that has been replaced largely by the M.A.R.C.H algorithm. And let me show you how far we've come, or tell you how far we've come, I guess is a better term. When I first went to Iraq for the invasion of Iraq, I was one of the first units to invade Iraq. I was there in Kuwait waiting for the war to start. I joined pre-9/11 in the Marine Corps, and we didn't even get issued tourniquets, right? We didn't get issued tourniquets, and it was kind of a stigma to not use a tourniquet unless you absolutely had to. It was kind of the misconception, and it was false, but we believed it at the time, that if you put a tourniquet on somebody, they were going to lose that limb, which is not true, but that's what we thought. So we weren't even issued tourniquets. We had tiny little, basically a little boo-boo first aid kit in a pouch on our kit, kind of as an afterthought. And you don't know what you don't know, right? But we were taught, I remember, basically taking a piece of cloth and a cleaning rod from your M16 cleaning kit in your buttstock that you normally had in there and making a hasty tourniquet if you absolutely had to. We've sure come a long way from not even having tourniquets to making them out of cleaning rods and pieces of fabric to good cat tourniquets and all the other kinds of tourniquets, SWAT, T, rats. I'm not getting into different kind of tourniquets. Cat is kind of your standard. And if you don't have any other reason, go with a cat tourniquet. Whatever gen we're on now, maybe Gen 7. But get a good cat tourniquet. All that to say, massive bleeding is the M in M.A.R.C.H algorithm. Massive bleeding is the cause of a ton of death in traumatic injuries. Massive bleeding, right? You need lifeblood. The spirit of life is in the blood, right? You need blood to live. I don't think I have to explain that. You need a certain amount of blood to live. If you go past that, you will die. So, massive bleeding. The primary way to take care of massive bleeding on a limb is a tourniquet. Tourniquets have limited use in that they are for extremities, right? They are for your arms and your legs. You don't tourniquet somebody's neck for obvious reasons. You can't really tourniquet a torso for obvious reasons. But arms and legs, which are a lot of times in wrecks and explosions and even firefights, what gets injured. So a tourniquet, a quick way to stop massive bleeding. You have to know how to apply a tourniquet. Again, this is not training, but you generally want to get as close to the heart as possible applying the tourniquet. So, let's say an arm, for example. Even if the injury is low down on the arm, you want to go high up on the arm to stop that bleeding in general. If you don't know any better, go high up as high as you can before you get into some obstruction or something like that. Same with the leg. Get high up on the leg. Get closer to the heart, so higher up on the leg, to stop that bleeding. Caveat, if there's stuff in the way up there, but you need to get above the injury, closer. You need to get in between the injury and the heart, and you need to put that tourniquet on. And again, this is not instruction, but get that tourniquet on, get it fairly snug to begin with, and then start cranking down that windlass. The windlass is that, on a cat tourniquet, it's that little bar that you want to twist and make that tourniquet tighter. You want to crank that down way more than you think you need to. You probably want to practice on yourself. A good way to practice on yourself is take your pulse, make sure you can feel a pulse before you start. That way you don't just assume that you stop the pulse. Make sure you can feel a good pulse in the wrist or in the leg somewhere, in the femoral artery. And you want to crank that tourniquet down until you cannot feel a pulse on yourself anymore. It should be very, very painful. You get that windlass cranked down to the point where you stop that blood flow, and then you secure that windlass. And again, you should look up how to do this. Put the time and the date on there. If for some reason said tourniquet is on securely and the flow of blood is not stopped, don't remove that tourniquet. If you can, you should try and put on another tourniquet. Now, a tourniquet is not always the right answer. Sometimes you may have to or want to use a pressure dressing or wound packing gauze. Again, these take practice and training. Applying direct pressure, if you know where arteries are, you know where things are to pinch off, to put pressure on to stop bleeding, that's a good thing. I generally will EDC a tourniquet every day. I know a lot of you probably don't. I would encourage you to, but if you don't, or you find yourself in a situation where you've already used your tourniquet and you still need to, applying direct pressure can be better than nothing. Or making a tourniquet, a hasty tourniquet, with pretty much anything. I made one once, not in practice, but I've made several in practice. I made one once, sadly, in real life, out of a belt and an ice scraper to stop a femoral artery bleed. Needless to say, after that, I started EDCing a tourniquet. Do not be like me. Learn from my mistake and start carrying a tourniquet before you get in a situation like that. I mentioned in the Marine Corps we didn't carry tourniquets. I was a police officer after the Marine Corps, and even at that time, which was far more recent, we still didn't EDC. We still didn't carry tourniquets as police officers. That wasn't part of our issued gear. I hope that it is now for a lot of departments, but it may not be. But needless to say, you can make a tourniquet, you can apply direct pressure, you can use pressure bandages, and you can pack wounds. There may be injuries where you can't put on a tourniquet. It's too high up, or in the pelvis, or in the abdomen. It's not a sucking chest wound, or the back, or something like that. The side of the head. The neck, right? You can't put a tourniquet on those things. You need to be familiar with these other techniques as well. But the basic principle is you take some kind of bandage and you apply pressure to stop the bleeding. And hopefully the blood will coagulate itself. Your body has its own mechanisms for stopping bleeding. And the more you can help your body do what it's supposed to do by stopping that bleeding, the faster and better it will go. There are quick clot gauzes and Israeli bandages and things like that. I encourage you to look into those. And Israeli bandages are really quite handy and quite nice. We did have things like those when I was in the military. They are quite handy and nice to have. I don't EDC one of those. I do EDC a tourniquet. But I do have several things, for example, in 2 med kits that are in my vehicle. One's within arm's reach right now as I'm driving on the passenger side dashboard, 550 corded on there. So, massive bleeding in the M.A.R.C.H algorithm. So, also under massive bleeding, you're going to have things like sucking chest wound, tension pneumothorax, which is far less common. But if you know, we also do another podcast called Gunfighter Life, so it's not that uncommon in our world. But still, actually far less common even for gunfighters than usually tourniquet-type wounds. But just know that sucking chest wounds are a thing. Audio only is probably not the way to explain that. But I'll do what I can here and try and keep it succinct. Basically, your lungs need a certain amount of pressure and things to operate. If you go poking holes in them, either 1 or 2, just an entry or an entry and an exit, you need to seal those up for the chest to be able to expand and contract and force air in or out to get oxygen to the blood, which is why your lungs exist, right? You can do that with some kind of airtight seals. Obviously, a purpose-built device for this. They make specific bandages for sucking chest wounds. You can make them out of an MRE sleeve or packaging or pretty much anything that's airtight. Not going to be as good as a purpose-built one, but you know, an MRE sleeve and some duct tape has been a standby for a while. If you can't get a purpose-built one, if the medic doesn't get to you in time, the corpsman. But just know, before we move away from massive bleeding, that is a thing that you probably want to be familiar with. And it doesn't just apply to gunshot wounds. You know, GSWs aren't the only thing. It could be any type of thing. You know, somebody could impale themselves riding a horse and fall on a fence post, or construction worker falling on rebar. Any number of things that would impale somebody through the chest. It's a bad day. But contrary to popular belief, you know, it may not mean a certain death. People can survive those kind of wounds, and you can certainly help if you have the training and knowledge to do so. Next is airway. Airway. Obviously, we as humans need to breathe. I don't think I need to explain that. So this is a good segue from the sucking chest wound. First, you need to determine, after you've done all the other things, survey the scene and look at bleeding and things like that, if the person is or is not breathing. That may sound simple, but an injured person may have all kinds of either sporadic breathing or not breathing at all. First, let's determine whether they are breathing at all. Are they breathing? The classic standby way to do this is look, listen, feel. You want to look if you can. Just make sure there's no obstruction from them breathing. You want to listen. Literally get your ear right next to their mouth. This may or may not help if the area is super noisy. You know, you're on the side of a freeway. You still may not be able to hear whether or not they're breathing, especially if it's really shallow breathing. Feel, you want to, if you can, rip their shirt open or take their shirt off or cut it open and literally lay your ear again next to their mouth and look down their chest and look for that chest rise and fall. You want to look for that and determine if they are breathing. Now, they may not be breathing normally. They may be breathing extremely shallow or extremely slowly, like far less breaths per minute than is normal, or they may be doing short, shallow breaths. But either one of these, I submit, is better than not breathing at all. So that's a step in the right direction if they are breathing. If you determine that CPR is necessary, first, hopefully you know how to administer CPR. CPR has changed quite a bit, like a lot of other things, since I first learned it. It used to be 15 and 2, meaning 15 chest compressions and 2 breaths. then it was 15 and 2. Or, sorry, first it was 15 and 2, then it was 30 and 2. I'm not even going to give a number now because it may have changed since the last time I learned it a few years ago again. But if you're going to administer breast, you obviously need to get a good seal, your mouth to their mouth, or if they're a small infant or a dog, you may need to do your mouth to their nose or their whole front of their face if it's a very young infant. And again, you should probably practice this on a dummy before the first time you actually have to do it to save somebody's life. But head tilt, chin lift, tilt the head back, lift the chin up, open the mouth, and give 2 slow, controlled breaths. Look, again, you should be looking as you're doing this to see the chest rise and fall. Even if the person is not breathing, if you do this correctly, their chest will rise and fall. Now give those 2 long, slow breaths. Hopefully they start breathing. That is not usually common, but that's your best case scenario. They start breathing right after that. If you should have already looked. If you can't get the breaths to go into the chest, then you may have an obstructed airway. That's a problem you're going to have to deal with. Again, look again. Your breaths or something may have worked something loose. You need to know how to do a finger sweep or roll them over. Literally strike them on the back. Or there's all kinds of ways to work the legs into the chest and abdomen. There are several techniques, but you need to clear that airway one way or another if you can. It is possible for you to come across somebody that is still conscious but can't breathe for that very reason. They have an obstructed airway. You're still learning things like the Heimlich, or striking them on the back the proper way, or turning a baby upside down in one arm and striking it between the shoulders with the other arm. Things like these are techniques that I am not teaching you. I'm telling you they exist, and you should go seek training on how to use them to clear an obstructed airway. But if they are not breathing and you're administering breaths and they're going in, then start administering CPR. Hopefully somebody else can call for more assistance, because you're probably going to need more assistance. You should call for assistance as soon as you can, maybe even before you administer any help. You may want to throw on a tourniquet first and then call for help, depending on how severe that is. But as soon as you can, you want to call for additional help if you can call. That's not always an option. If you're in the wilderness, for example, or if you're in a massive casualty situation, comms are likely going to be down if you're talking about your cell phone or things like that, right? So just be aware of that, but try and call for help when you can. But airway, you need that person to breathe, and if they can't breathe, you kind of need to breathe for them. Now that is the A and the R M.A.R.C.H algorithm: airway and respiratory. Now those kind of go together because they're kind of part of the breathing system. Again, you are trying to get oxygen into their lungs and into their bloodstream. Obviously, that is important. I shouldn't have to explain that. But whether you can get them to breathe on their own or you have to literally breathe for them. There are also devices, but if you don't have any of this training already, you probably don't know how to use one of those devices. But it's basically a bag with a little kind of face mask that fits over their nose and mouth that you can press on. AUDs are another thing, but you really need training to use those. Don't just think you've seen it in TV and strap a couple paddles to somebody and go shocking them to get them back conscious again. So airway, breathing, and then circulation. So this is going to be, after you've worked those other things in the algorithm, you may want to assist them if they are breathing on their own by now. Assist them in recovery, whether that's laying them flat on their back or laying them on their side, depending on the injury or depending on if they're vomiting or things like that. Vomiting is not uncommon in massive injury. I know that from firsthand experience as well. Vomiting is quite common. Just your body tends to do that with massive injury. So obviously if they're vomiting, you want to put them on their side. If they're not vomiting, perhaps on their back. Or also, sadly in our culture today, a lot of people may be massively overweight. You may want to put them on their side to help them instead of on their back. You may want to administer fluids if you think that's best, if you have the training and experience, if they're asking for water and they don't have some kind of injury or some kind of condition where that's going to actually hurt them. But you want to aid in that and If somebody is better hydrated, their body functions, their breathing, their circulation, their oxygen in their blood, things like that are going to work better if they have the right amount of fluid. Obviously, being dehydrated is not good in the best of times. It's certainly worse if you are on the edge of death anyway. The last one may seem a peculiar one, especially if you live in a hot place like Florida or Las Vegas or the deserts of Arizona, the Sonoran Desert or the Mojave Desert. But it is quite real in massive trauma situations. When you lose blood, and I'm not a scientist, I don't know exactly how this works, but I can tell you that it is quite common, again from firsthand experience, when somebody loses a lot of blood, they feel very cold and their body temperature drops. They are in fact actually cold. And it doesn't need to be very cold outside for that person to slip into hypothermia. Okay, so if they have a massive bleeding incident, you need to be aware of hypothermia, even if it's a nice 72 room temperature degree day. If they've lost a lot of blood, hypothermia can be a very real thing. The same things you would normally do that don't interfere with the injury to warm somebody up. If you have, dry, warm blankets, a quick go-to in a lot of medical kits and a lot of things like I have in my baby bug-out bag and are useful for a lot of things. I have used them for regular hypothermia situations and they do work. They're not a gimmick. Are the space blankets, the M.A.R.C.H blankets. They do actually work. I've had to use those in real life and they do in fact work. They are worth every penny of the 99 cents or $1.50, whatever they are with inflation right now. They are worth every penny of that for a lot of situations. They are good from this situation, preventing hypothermia for an injury or just preventing it in general, or in addition to a sleeping bag or a hunting trip or laying on the ground to butcher meat so it doesn't get dirty. I've used those in all manner of situations. They are worth every penny of the $1 or $2 or whatever they cost. If they were $10, they would be worth every penny. But hypothermia. Also, you may want to be wary of heat casualties, because if it's not a massive bleeding situation and heat casualties are a thing. This may be going outside the M.A.R.C.H algorithm, but heat casualties, if you do live in Florida, if you do live in Arizona, or really anywhere, you could be in North Dakota in the summer and it could get super hot. And if somebody's not accustomed to that, you need to be able to treat heat casualties, know the difference between a heat stroke, heat exhaustion, and things like that. Not sweating may be a bad thing. Knowing how to look for heat casualties, how to treat them, putting them in the shade, giving them slow sips of cold water. If you give them too much water all at once, they may throw it up and be worse than when they started. But know how to treat a heat casualty. When I was not in Iraq, which was crazy hot, and as you might imagine, we had heat casualties there. Let's just say the Marines have a way of dealing with heat casualties that is not pleasant or dignified. Thankfully, I didn't have to receive any of that treatment, but I certainly, let's just say it was a thing. I won't say any names. And when I wasn't in Iraq, I was generally in 29 Palms in the middle of the Mojave Desert, not that far away from Death Valley. And heat casualties are a thing there too. Heat casualties are a thing. And on that note, not really in the M.A.R.C.H algorithm, but hypothermia, but cold casualties, not in relation to massive trauma, but just cold casualties, hypothermia. So you need to be able to deal with extreme hot and extreme cold. Now let's talk about head injuries, since that starts with H. Head injuries are a thing, and they're kind of their own unique thing. If we're talking about massive trauma, massive bleeding, obviously if it's a massive bleeding, we kind of covered that in massive bleeding in the beginning, massive hemorrhaging. You want to try and stop the bleeding, but you don't, unless you know what caused the injury and it wasn't like massive blunt trauma. If they just received like a slice to the head, then you probably don't have to worry about brain injury if it didn't get inside the skull. But if you don't know what happened, you come upon like a car wreck and somebody has a massive head injury, try and move that head, that C-spine, that spine, as little as possible, right? You don't want to agitate that spinal cord, that brain stem, or the brain itself, the head. So if you don't have to, don't do any more trauma to that head. obvious signs of head trauma, not just head trauma. I know from firsthand experience that this is general in a lot of drug cases, drug abuse cases, and things like that. But the pupils, if you don't assume the person's on drugs or any other medical conditions, let's just call it crazy pupils. All right, that's an easy way to remember it. Their pupils are far too small than they should be, or they're far too big than they should be, or one is small and one is big. Obviously, right? That's not normal, and that is a sign of head trauma. Pupils, horizontal nystagmus, vertical nystagmus, which is a fancy way of saying that the pupils kind of jump back and forth. They can't really focus. They'll literally jot back and forth, up and down. You'll see things like that. Again, you'll see super dilated pupils or super constricted pupils. A real common one, if it's not for like hypothermia or heat or casualties or something like that, or massive trauma, they may just not be able to answer simple questions. You'll see EMTs and medics, which I am not an EMT, but they'll see them administer very simple questions. Who's the president? What year is it? What year were you born? Things like that. Simple math questions to figure out if they have any kind of head trauma or any kind of thing going on. But a head injury is a thing. And again, the big thing for that is don't do any more head trauma. Try not to do that. If they don't need to be moved or don't need a massive hemorrhage thing right away, if they don't need something taken out of their airway because they can't breathe, then try not to mess with the head. Do as little with the head as you have to is probably in general a good thing. And there are exceptions, again, massive bleeding and airway problems or things like that. So there is that for the M.A.R.C.H algorithm. I may have forgotten one thing or two. Again, I am literally driving. Don't worry, I have a hands-free headset. Alright, I should mention, we talked about tourniquets and things like that and medical kits, and I'm not talking about the ones you buy at Walmart for a Band-Aid kit. You probably should have one of those in your car, in your home. I'm talking about a kit for the M.A.R.C.H algorithm. Now, I'm going to recommend, because I have their stuff and it's good quality, M.A.R.C.H Independent and Refuge Medical. M.A.R.C.H Independent, he's the founder and CEO of Refuge Medical. They don't give me any kickback. They did not ask me to do this. In fact, they don't give me any money. In fact, I pay them money. I am a patron of M.A.R.C. Independent. Like I have people that are a patron and support me. I am a patron of M.A.R.C. Independent. And not for the Refuge Medical sake, but because I want to support what he does. I don't know if we'd agree 100% theologically, but I think much more than most, because I read and believe the entire Bible and try to walk it out. And anyway, for that reason, I give money to M.A.R.C. Independent as a patron. I also buy the medical kits from Refuge Medical. I would encourage you to check those out because they're good quality American-made kits. And again, I get no kickback from them. I spent my own good money on those kits. Actually, I spent some of my wife's health savings account money on the kits because you can do that, and she has one, or we have one, however you want to phrase that. But anyway, we have several of their kits. I have one in my car. I have one in my wife's car, who's right behind me now in our little convoy driving through Wyoming. Their kits are good kits. And they sell a bunch of other kits. If you don't have an IFAC, I would recommend starting with an IFAC. But Refuge Medical makes good kits. I would encourage you to think about, in addition to your knife, which I think you should carry as a man, and your firearm, which you should carry as a man, and several other things. I won't make this an EDC episode, but a tourniquet is something you ought to consider carrying as an alpha male. Anyway, Refuge Medical will be my recommendation for that. They also do training. This podcast is not training. I am not a doctor. I am not a lawyer. I'm a podcaster who has some firsthand real-world experience in training, but this podcast is not training. Go get training. Refuge Medical also offers training. North American Rescue and other places also offer kits and training. I got mine when I worked for a 3-letter government agency as a private contractor. I won't specify as far as TCCC goes, but TCCC is a good course. I would encourage you to seek out training, actual training. This is not that. This is knowledge. for you to have that I hope that you found helpful, and I hope you will use to further your walk down this road of surviving and being prepared and providing and protecting for yourself and others as an alpha male. Let's talk about a few other things outside that algorithm. How about transport? Now, a lot of people live east of the Mississippi and they live somewhere where they have cell service, and probably transport is not something you're going to have to worry about. If you do, they're probably just going to throw them in your car and drive them to the hospital, which I don't think I have to explain. Again, beware of head and neck injuries when you may not want to do that. You may want to wait for professionals to do that. You may do more harm than good trying to do good. However, there may be times, whether that be you're out in the wilderness, backpacking, off-grid, out of cell service, or some kind of massive incident, right, where there is none of these things. There are no infrastructure, ambulances aren't running, or they're overwhelmed, or who knows what. I don't apologize for being a survivalist, and I like to be able to survive. So transport is part of that. What if you have to get that person to somewhere where you can at least get cell service, or you may not want to leave them alone because they might die, or you have to transport them down a trail, off a mountain, something like that. You have to know how to transport a casualty. Do this a lot in the Marine Corps, buddy carries. It's another reason you alpha males out there had better be in shape. It is important. I am on a several-day road trip right now. That does not give me the excuse to not work out. I literally stopped this morning and did wife squats with my wife on my back or in my front if I was doing front wife squats, right? Several different ways to do a wife squat. Literally with my wife on my back. And then I did wife push-ups where she sat on my back and I did push-ups. Right? Being in shape is important. Not just for yourself. If you're an alpha male, you ought to see it as your duty to protect and provide for those around you. That's hard to do in these kind of situations if you can't walk up a flight of steps without getting out of breath. So a buddy carry, if you can just literally throw that person on your back and carry them. This is far easier if they can stand. Trying to get a bunch of dead weight like literally a limp, who knows how many pounds of flesh and bone on your back when they can't help is quite a bit harder. Also, it may be as simple as dragging them out of a room where you are taking fire. You know, something like that person is down and you hopefully are with a buddy. That buddy steps in front of them to fire at the opponent and cover you while you grab your buddy and drag them out of a room. That is a pretty short but very important transport of a casualty. You should be familiar with a drag, like dragging somebody. Not in a long distance, but in a short distance. So again, dragging them out of a room or dragging them out of, somewhere that's on fire. Casualty transport is important. If you need to go farther than that, you may have to make something. A poleless litter is probably not something you're going to have or most people are going to have. I don't even have one. I know how to make one by getting a couple of poles and cutting the sleeves off a fairly robust jacket or a BDU shirt or something like that. Certainly can be done. I certainly have the skills to make a litter out of a couple of sticks and set somebody on with some rope. And that may be something you may have to do one day if you're, again, way out in the backcountry. But think about transport. We talked about hot and cold casualties earlier. You may have to, wherever they receive that cold casualty, like you pull them out, and we'll get to water rescue later on, but you pull them out of a freezing cold creek and you might have to get them to a dry area where you can make a fire, right? That's casualty transport. You may have to get them from somewhere hot. Maybe you're out in the desert and there's no shade around you and you have to literally carry them to somewhere where there is shade. Again, being in shape is important for a lot more than just having six-pack abs. It can save lives. I like guns as much as the next person. I have a whole other podcast called Gunfighter Life. But if you buy guns more than you do push-ups or run, I would say that is the wrong answer. You have your priorities messed up. And that may not be popular, but I'm going to say it anyway because it's true. Anyway, moving casualties. Let's talk about another thing that sadly is probably more relevant today than it has been since the Cuban Missile Crisis. That's nuclear. Contrary to what a lot of people just resign themselves to, if we get nuked, it's just over. It's the end, and I'm just going to tuck my tail between my legs or put my head between my legs. If that's the way you think, then I would say you're listening to the wrong podcast. That's not what alpha males do. Alpha males fight to the end. There's plenty of people that survived Hiroshima and Nagasaki and went on to have kids, and it's certainly not good, but it's certainly not the end of the world. It may be the end of the world as we know it, but it won't be the end of the world, and you shouldn't just throw up your hands and give up. Now, that old saying, an ounce of prevention is better than a pound of cure, I would say as far as nuclear and radiation stuff goes, an ounce of prevention is better than 100 pounds of cure. Don't live in cities. That's probably the biggest one. Those are going to be the targets. But you may or may not heed that advice. In general, and there are massive exceptions, but in general, if a place gets nuked, that fallout is going to go east. Massive weather patterns in the U.S., except for small pockets, generally go west to east. So if you're looking to buy a house somewhere, if you're going to do the suburb thing in a people hive, as I like to call them, try and be on the west side of a city versus the east side of a city. Or if you just see a mushroom cloud go up, in general, if you can, go west. Or if you don't have time to go west, or you have a good place, go underground. The thicker the material, the better it will stop the radiation from getting to you. Example, lead. That's why you wear a lead vest. It is the densest common material. That's why you use it when you get an X-ray. But anyway, Earth is far more dense than drywall. That's why in the 50s when they built nuclear fallout shelters, they built them underground. I will say there are a bunch of civil defense films. Sadly, we do not have a national civil defense anymore. Maybe they'll bring it back. I don't know. But those films are free, and a lot of them are in the public domain, and you can go watch them. Just some general things. Again, an ounce of prevention is better, but potassium iodate, that's a thing, and that's not like a cure-all. It's not like you're starting to grow a third eyeball, which is not a real thing. That doesn't actually happen. But it's not like you're starting to grow a third eyeball like the fish on The Simpsons, and you take potassium iodate and everything's fine, and you're skipping like one of those drug commercials on TV, which are ridiculous. That's not how that works. It will aid if you take it fast enough in stopping your thyroid from absorbing radioactive iodine by giving it proper iodine so it doesn't seek any more outside radioactive stuff. But it's not a cure-all. It's a very small niche thing. I'm not saying you shouldn't have it. I'm not saying it's not important, but I am saying that it's not like you can just walk into a mushroom cloud and take some of these pills and you're going to be fine. That's not how that works. Also, pectin is common. It's cheap. It does a lot to remove radiation from your body. Again, prevention is better. I guess nobody talks about that because it's not cool and it doesn't make a bunch of people online a bunch of money by scaring you into buying something in a bottle. But literally, pectin, which can be found in jams and jellies, or you can just buy it straight. It's super cheap. They'll have it at Walmart. Usually they'll have it at Fred Meyer or whatever big box store is near you. You should be able to find pectin. The wife and I do quite a bit of foraging and making our own jam. It's one of the hobbies we like to do together, which will lead into the next thing I'm going to talk about. But pectin can be useful for removing radiation. Getting away from the radiation stuff and injuries. Toxins, other toxins, right? I mentioned my wife and I like to do a lot of foraging. One thing we don't forage is mushrooms. There may be 3 kinds of mushrooms of all the research I've ever done and all the outdoor foraging I've ever done that I would feel comfortable in eating and being fairly confident. I guess you can never be 100% sure. but that I would be fairly confident I could eat those mushrooms. Most of them I won't eat. But even that said, a lot of berries that look really delicious are deadly, like nightshade. A lot of things that look really disgusting are totally edible and delicious, like spirulina. Again, my wife and I do quite a bit of foraging. I love to hunt. My wife likes to forage. We do a lot of foraging. But if you were to eat something toxic, whether you or a kid, they accidentally get into something under the sink, again, in normal times, call poison control. But there may be times when you want to. There are times, depending on the toxin, you should know this, and I'm not going to give specifics because I'm not a doctor, but there are certain times when you want to induce vomiting. So know how to do that, know how to administer charcoal, know the right and wrong circumstances to do that. Again, you probably want a professional to do that, but if there comes a time when there are no professionals or you can't get a hold of one, you may want to know when charcoal is a good thing to administer. You may want to be able to get some or have some or find some or make some and store it, but charcoal, I'm not talking about like the briquettes. You know, don't go shoving a Kingsford charcoal thing down somebody's throat. But charcoal is a thing. It does help in certain circumstances. Inducing vomiting can be the best thing. It can be bad in other circumstances, so know when to do that. But know how to treat toxins. You know, don't forget about the little killers out there. Again, they kill a lot of people. You may have the coolest mutual assistance group decked out in the coolest multi-cam black with, you know, Cry Jump 2 plate carriers and Scar 17s. All that stuff is awesome. But if some big disaster happens and then, you know, half of your guys go down and die of dysentery, which is a thing that happens, and then another guy gets Lyme disease, you know, you're not real combat effective there. So don't overlook those kind of things. If you want to be into being an alpha male, means being able to provide and protect those in your family and those under your dominion and control. So antibiotics, the last thing I'll talk about, because I may have more experience in this than other people, is water rescue, depending on your life. Now, if you live in Arizona, and, I guess it could still be a thing. A lot of people have swimming pools, right? And a lot of little kids go around swimming pools. But water is a thing that kills people. I guess, number one, you should know how to swim, right? And then when we say survey the scene, you don't want to jump into a body of water to save somebody if you can't swim. Again, that's not going to help them or you. But if you do know how to swim and you're a competent swimmer, you may want to know how to do some water rescue techniques, how to grab somebody, whether they're conscious or unconscious, when to swim up to them and when not to. If they're freaking out and flailing around, just going right up to them may get you both in a lot of trouble. But knowing things like that, knowing water rescue, knowing how to get water out of somebody's chest and things like that, water rescue is something, again, I think often overlooked. That is one thing I've had to do in real life. As I mentioned, I have been a lifeguard professionally, but I wasn't actually working as a lifeguard. There's times when I, got kids and stuff like that, but the one time I thought somebody actually might die, they probably would have, likely, if I had not. Well, who knows what would have happened, but it was a situation where I certainly had to intervene in good conscience, and that was an adult young lady in a canoe in the middle of winter where the canoe flipped over and she was in a bunch of winter clothes and either wasn't a good swimmer to start with or had a hard time swimming in all those winter clothes, which is something you ought to practice. We practice quite a bit in the Marine Corps, swimming in full boots and things like that, but it's quite a bit more difficult swimming in armor and boots and a helmet and things like that. But anyway, I had to jump in to save this young lady. I don't know how good a swimmer she was in normal times, but she wasn't doing too good in the middle of winter in a body of water, fully clothed in all her winter clothing, and I believe had been heavily drinking. Thankfully, that turned out well. I was able to get her out of that body of water, and even me being a very competent swimmer, I remember that being quite an ordeal. Again, water rescue and swift water rescue is its own thing, and I'd really have no experience doing that. So, that's its own kind of skill. But water rescue is a thing that's often overlooked and not talked about. But maybe something you want to look at. If you are a competent swimmer, maybe you want to have that skill of saving other people that need help in the water. Anyway, I hope that you have enjoyed this episode. I originally meant it to be just on the M.A.R.C.H algorithm, but I kind of thought there were some things that are often left out that I wanted to tie in there. It's probably going to be a long episode, but hey, I've got a long drive. And if you've listened to the end, I truly appreciate it. If you thought any of this info was worth $5 a month, which is the minimum it costs to become a patron. If you've listened to more than one episode, you keep coming back for the fraction of the cost of probably what potassium iodate costs now, or the fraction of what a tourniquet costs, or the fraction of a cost of a box of ammo. $5 a month, you can become a patron. We are doing, if this comes out in the month of November, through the month of November in the year of our Lord 2022, one of the current patrons graciously, without any coercion, agreed to step up and offer a knife, a K-bar folding hunter, which would be a great EDC knife, I think, to be raffled off to any of the people that become a patron and live in the United States in the month of November. So I mostly want you to join because you believe in this podcast, you want it to reach more people, and you want to help support. And you think it's worth it. But if you haven't become a patron, I encourage you to. There's a lot of cool patron-only insider content that you are privy to. Different shooting drills and training things like that are on there. Not to mention, if you want to become, which is open to any patron that wants to, I'm free to kick them out if they get rowdy. But we have an inside, like, inner circle tribal chat where we talk about answer each other's questions on gun stuff and medical stuff and all kinds of things. Maybe just as iron sharpens iron, one man sharpens another. I'm very blessed and humbled to be a part of that chat and that group. Anyway, that's another thing open to the patrons. Enough about Patreon. Thank you for listening. If you listened, I threw out a couple of tactical tips. Your tactical tip of the day. We talked a lot about patching holes. And maybe I'll talk a little bit about making holes. I learned about this by listening to an account of Inuit, or perhaps First Nation. I don't mean any disrespect, I just honestly don't know what they prefer to be called. Let's say Inuit, let's say First Nation. Anyway, it was an account of, and I don't know if this is true, by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses a matter is established, but it certainly makes sense and it certainly can be done, that they would have a rifle and they would shoot a seal or an animal, and they would take that brass cartridge case and they would pound it flat and sharpen one end of it to make a knife. So if you find yourself in a situation because you've tipped your canoe or tumbled down a mountain and you've lost your knife or whatever, and you have, or you find, in a lot of the backcountry, you'll find a shell casing, a brass 30-30 or 270 casing is not uncommon to find on a mountain in Idaho. Anyway, you have a piece of brass. It was called the Bronze Age for a reason, right? Hardened copper with other elements was used for a long time to make weapons. So if you need a knife and you can get a piece of brass, you can pound it flat and sharpen one end of it with just rocks. Is it the best knife? No. Is it a buck 110? No. Is it a, Roman gladius? No, it's not. But you certainly could make an arrowhead or a spear point or a knife. If the Inuits could skin a seal doing this, you could probably, let's say use it to clean a fish. Or who knows what else. Also recently was listening to a thing on the metal age here in America. Again, First Nation, Native Americans, whatever they want to be called. The first place finishers across the Bering Strait finish line. Whatever. We a lot of times think of the Indians, the Native Americans, as just using stone tools, but they had their own copper age. The Great Lakes region had copper on the surface, and they pounded it into arrowheads and into different skinning implements and things like that. They literally just worked it into the shape that they wanted without even having to fire it up in a furnace. Well, the copper and brass we have today, a lot of times for us in this kind of world, is those cartridge cases. And there's no reason you couldn't use that today to make a knife or an arrowhead or things like that. Again, it's not a good, S30V, super tactical knife or 1095 tops knife, but it's certainly better than nothing. So that's your tactical tip of the day. 30-06 shell, 308 case, whatever. Pound it flat, sharpen one end, and you have a field expedient knife. Your tactical verse of the day, coming at you from Ecclesiastes. If you really need some perspective in life, if you find yourself way too focused on things that really aren't that important, how many likes you got on Facebook or Instagram or whatever, go read Ecclesiastes, at least the first couple of chapters, and it'll likely give you some perspective. But for everything there is a season, and I'm driving so I don't have this whole thing committed to memory. You should go read it. But there is a time to be born and a time to die. There is a time for war and a time for peace. There's a time to love and a time to hate. A time to gather stones and a time to cast away stones. For a modern iteration of that, there is a time to make holes and there is a time to patch holes. In keeping with today's episode, there's a time to make injuries and there's a time to repair injuries. A good, well-rounded alpha male ought to be acquainted with both. With that, men, thank you for listening to the Alpha Male Podcast and have a blessed day.